Night Fever, Night Fever, you are the dancing queen, DISCO. What the f*** am I doing? The 1970s saw a shift from the guitar-heavy pop of the previous decade to a more splintered music scene, with warring rock and disco factions vying for control of the charts. It was also a time of economic downturn, and cost-cutting measures by Fender and Gibson meant that the guitar market was more competitive than ever, and boy did it produce some bizarre guitars. With that in mind, I'm Mark from Guitar Nerds, and these are my top 5 weirdest guitars of the 1970s. Number 5. As with the 1960s, the 1970s saw the Japanese guitar market continue to grow. But unlike the previous decade, manufacturers were now heavily focused on producing guitars that looked, felt and sounded like their American counterparts. And while some of these aimed for dead-on replicas, some came with a twist. Now, it was really hard to find any information on, but this Strat seems to have been released under both the Yasuki and Condor Corporation brand names, with both models being incredibly hard to find. Taking design cues from the big headstock Fender Strats of the late 1970s, it looked similar to other Japanese copies of the time, but with a rather ugly additional scratch plate that housed a range of analog effects. Again, details of exactly what these effects were seems to have been lost to the mist of time, but the plate has them listed as treble booster, a switchable boost and distortion circuit, and phaser with a speed control. While guitars with built-in effects have appeared in every decade, I've included the Yasuki Strat to this list because of its dual identities, incredible rarity, and scarcity of any real information on its origin. Number 4. If you watched our previous video, you'll know that Yamaha produced some wild guitars in the 1960s, and they certainly didn't stop in the following decade. Rather than the groovy, flowing lines of the 60s SGV models, the flagship model of the 1970s embodied the more muted feeling of the time. The SG80T featured a very brown, all-mahogany construction, an aesthetic adopted by many guitar manufacturers in the 70s. But what made it unique was the ornate German body carve and complex tone shaping circuit. A new feature for Yamaha guitars, the tone circuit included a 5-way switch, individual treble and bass controls, and an overall tone boost knob. Combined with a sophisticated trem, the SG80T was a guitar ahead of its time. Unfortunately, a little too far ahead of its time. Available for only a few short months in 1972, and only in Japan, the SG80T was soon replaced by the more symmetrical SG series that is still in production today. Number 3. When you hear the words Ovation guitars, what comes to mind? Is it the durable plastic construction? How about the ornate triple sound holes? Maybe the powerful preamp included in almost all of their acoustics. Well, I bet one thing that doesn't come to mind is the range of beautifully bizarre solid body electrics they produced in the 1970s. Founded in 1964, Ovation set out to improve guitars by using non-traditional materials, and by late 1966 they had settled on a lyra cord back that improved sustain and increased stability. Introduced to the world stage by Glenn Campbell in 1968, the company was poised for greatness. And in the acoustic world, greatness is what they achieved. However, the company were yet to move into the electric guitar market. That all changed in 1972. One of the first electric guitars featuring active electronics, the Ovation Breadwinner is a truly weird beast. The strange wing-shaped design, giant control knobs and onboard preamp meant that on release it was unlike anything else on the market. Originally featuring the company's own toroidal single-pole pickups, later models feature mini humbuckers, but both versions have been highly praised for their unique sound. Despite the addition of a second model, the fancier Deacon, Ovation Electrics did not take off, and both models were discontinued by the end of the decade. However, if you look very closely, you can see a Breadwinner being played by 70s pop genius Bjorn Ulvaeus of ABBA in the band's eponymous movie. Number 2. In a decade where rock was muscular, outlandish, and not afraid to be different, is it any wonder that BC Rich found success? Founded in 1969, they very quickly became known for their pointy shapes and hard rocking tones. And one design took things to the extreme. Designed by legendary guitar tech Neil Moser, the BC Rich Bich 10-string has become a thing of legend. Never originally making it past the prototype stage, the design was actually the property of Moser and licensed out by the brand. Wondering how a 10-string works? Well, let me explain. Much like a 12-string, the top E and B strings were strung in unison pairs, and the G and D strings as pairs with original and octave string. However, the A and lower E strings remain the same as on any normal electric guitar, with the idea being that you could achieve a ringing 12-string tone while retaining definition on the low strings. In a radical bit of design, the unison and octave strings are anchored to the headstock and tuned at the base of the guitar. While this wild 70s guitar never made it to market, Moser and luthier Sal Gonzalez were brought back by BC Rich in 2003 to produce 25 limited edition anniversary models of their fabled 10-string. However, things didn't go to plan as a contract dispute between Moser and BC Rich meant that only 16 guitars were ever made. Number 1. What would a Guitar Nerds list be without a synth guitar? Nearly every weirdest list we've done has featured at least one, and this list is no exception. 1977 was a huge year for Roland. Not only did they release the first compact pedals with the legendary Boss Traffic Light series, but they kickstarted a revolution in guitar synthesis with the GR500 synth and the GS-500 guitar. Produced in the acclaimed Fujigen factory, the GS-500 was a Les Paul-shaped guitar without a traditional jack output that functioned solely as a controller for the accompanying synth module. Connecting via Roland's own 24-pin cable, the GS-500 featured 7 knobs, allowing the player to control the volume and tone of the traditional humbucking pickup, as well as the 4 sections of the synth module. The guitar's 8 switches enabled the player to switch between the magnetic pickup, synth or both, turn on and off each setting of the synth, enable portamento, and switch between 3 different EQ settings for the traditional pickup. Quite the control layout. By today's standards, the tracking on the GS500 is terrible, but for the time it was an incredible piece of kit. A huge step forward in guitar synthesis, the sheer audacity of the GS500 and the accompanying synth module make it our weirdest guitar of the 1970s. So that was the 1970s, but did we miss anything? Let me know in the comments below. Make sure to like this video and subscribe to Guitar Nerds because we've got lists for the 1980s, 1990s and 2000s coming for you very soon. Thanks very much and we'll see you next time.